It's a privilege and a joy for me to be here with Frank Bruni. 20 years ago, I was based in Jerusalem for the New York Times, and Frank was then the Rome bureau chief of the New York Times. He was, in my view, writing about beautiful places and great food and clothes, and I was covering the Second Intifada. And our masters rightly decided I needed help. And they sent Frank, who I think had no experience covering the conflict. I'm not sure you'd ever even been to Jerusalem at that point.
Not till the first time I went, yeah.
And so Frank arrives, and he asks a few people questions. He pokes around for a little while, and he sits down and starts writing stories that were at least as sophisticated as anything I could produce.
Not true.
It is a humbling thing as a journalist to work alongside Frank, who has been a journalist just about every way you can, and I think has done it as well in each of those roles as anybody has. He's been a food critic and a film critic, and as I said, a foreign correspondent, a White House correspondent, a campaign political correspondent, a magazine writer, and an opinion columnist, as you all know, a role in which he's been able to integrate all that experience and make a big contribution, I think, to public debate, and also, I think, supply a dose of inspiration and optimism, which is badly needed. And he's a book writer. He's written 4 books, all of them bestsellers, and we're here to talk about The Age of Grievance, the most recent.
But can I first say how delighted I am to be here with James. We're friends, we go way back. James was my boss at the Times for what, 5, 6, 7 years?
No, last 4.
And you will not meet a more elegant...
Just felt like 7.
You will not meet a more elegant writer or a nicer human being than James Bennet.
No, thank you, Frank.
It's true.
So let's set the table. One of the points, overarching points you make is that this grievance, the age of grievance in which we're living, people feel a sense of oppression. Mm-hmm. You say it's more of a problem on the right than on the left. And maybe a starting point would be for you to tell a couple of stories you tell in the book. Early on, you tell a story about pumping gas on the Merritt Parkway and a sort of searing experience you had. So let's hear that one.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. There were 2 things that kind of happened in my life outside of journalism, that being one that for me kind of really crystallized just how angry we'd become and how polarized. And one was a simple incident. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Connecticut and the Merritt Parkway, or probably a lot of people. Okay, sure. During the first months of the pandemic, when the advice we were still getting from federal health officials was to be masked outdoors if you were going to be really close to someone, I pulled over for gas on the Merritt Parkway. You know how tiny those gas stations are, how close together the pumps are. And so even though I was outside, I thought I should do the right thing and put on a mask. You know, I wasn't... In hindsight, we're looking what was good advice, what was bad advice. At the time, you sort of tried to do what you felt made you a decent, respectful, considerate person and didn't kind of sweat the epidemiology of it all, right? And I'm pumping my gas, and I hear someone shouting really angrily, and I look around to see what this person's shouting about and who this person's shouting at, and he's shouting at me. And he's saying, take off your bleeping mask, and worse things than that, and saying, you're the problem with this country, you're why we have no freedom. And I don't mean this as caricature, but I look up like over his shoulder, and I see that the vehicle that he's associated with is a big pickup truck festooned with MAGA regalia. That's just the fact of it. But it was the fever pitch of this, and just the hatred in it, felt to me like something new. And I remember thinking at the time, when 9/11 happened, you know, we actually for a brief time pulled together, and it's crazy. If you go back and you look, there are opinion polls from that time where George W. Bush has 90%, 87% approval ratings. I don't think in our remaining lifetimes we will ever see an American president have an approval rating even over 65%, because we've become so polarized and we've become so intractable in our views. And I was thinking, like, what happened with the pandemic, another event that was enormous, that potentially touched everyone, like the attack of 9/11. We didn't do any of the things that happened after 9/11. In fact, we retreated even more deeply and even more resentfully into our corners. Because it wasn't just me at that gas station. I was hearing stories from everybody about encounters on the grocery checkout line, et cetera. Everybody was turning on one another in exactly the kind of circumstance where in the past you would come together. And that really haunted me. If I can mention one other thing that haunted me, last time I was at this festival, I was talking about my previous book, The Beauty of Dusk, which is about a rare stroke I had and the threat and my diminished eyesight and the threat I live with blindness, et cetera, et cetera. After I wrote that book, I got a lot of the kind of response I was hoping to get. I meant that book to be instructive, maybe, inspirational. I meant it to be a help, if anything, and I was helping myself by writing it. There was this kind of subcategory of feedback I got where people would write and in really, really kind of vicious language tell me how cruel I was, because by putting out a book that showed me being resilient and coping, I was inherently shaming and mocking all those people who didn't have the same psychological resources. And it gave me pause because I felt bad, but then I thought, this is another example of a culture, of a moment in time in which people decide to be offended. They decide on a read of circumstances that will feed their anger and make them feel wronged. And that is a decision, and too many of us are making it these days.
Yeah, I was astonished by that story in the book. It really felt like people were looking for a reason to be angry and looking for a reason to attack you.
Yes.
So where did this come from? You quote, there's a wonderful quote you have from Tocqueville, that Americans are forever brooding over advantages they do not possess. So there's something in our culture, this goes back a long way, but it wasn't evident in our politics and our culture to the same extent it has been in the last, well, what period, and why do you think it
I mean, I think the period we're really looking at and talking about, is from the mid-'90s, early '90s onward, where I think things started to turn. But I mean, I'll pick another point on the timeline, something that fascinates me. So brooding, yes, but we weren't in a funk this deep and this persistent. This country has always run on optimism. I mean, you think of all the phrases, manifest destiny, endless frontier, and on, the sky's the limit, et cetera. This is a country that has always told itself and told its people that our tomorrow is going to be brighter than our today, because that's what we're all about.
And when you say we also kind of valorize the stoic cowboy,
right.
Yeah.
Up until, since the 1970s, multiple times a year, the Gallup organization, which is of course the gold standard in polling, has asked Americans, are you generally satisfied with the direction of the country? Other pollsters ask that in different language, but they've been doing that at least 4 and sometimes more times a year since the mid-'70s. Up until 2004, if you looked at the line, if you looked at the 50% line and then what the response is, there were as many times when 55 or 60% of people would say they were generally satisfied with the direction of the country as there were times when it dipped down to 40 or whatever. Starting in 2004 to this moment in time, so we're talking 21 uninterrupted years, they have never gotten a response where even 50% of Americans said they were generally satisfied with the direction of the country. And most often, the response rate is, the number of people who are saying they're satisfied is somewhere between 20 and 35%. For 21 uninterrupted years. That's like a fundamental shift in the American psyche. And if you don't believe that tomorrow might be brighter, if you don't believe that the metaphoric, archetypal pie is growing, you have a totally different relationship to the people around you. Your relationship with them is now competitive rather than collaborative. If somebody else is winning, you must be losing because we're not growing and things aren't getting better. And I think that's one of the principal reasons that we have the politics we do is because we've sunk into a sustained and profound pessimism.
And do you think that pessimism is justified?
It's not. I mean, that's what's crazy. There are so many forces that distort our view of our own lives. The internet is a big one, social media. But it's not justified. In 2016, and I mention it in the book, in the last year of his presidency, and it's really interesting to kind of listen carefully to presidents who are not going to be running for another election, who've done what they've done. They start to speak in a way that is not so much geared toward re-election of their self-preservation. They become more reflective. And in April of 2016, Barack Obama goes to Hanover, Germany, and he gives a speech, and I can't remember why this speech at this moment, but it has everything to do with the fact that he was being reflective in his presidency, was kind of nearing an end. And he said, in regard to how angry everybody seemed and how negative everybody seemed, he said, if you looked at figures about, poverty versus affluence, hunger versus if you looked at any sort of measurable statistics, you would, and someone said, when would you choose to be alive? You would choose this moment in time. This is the best moment in time. And if you had to choose one country just based on the evidence, to be alive in, it would be the United States of America. And that is not, and that hasn't changed that much from 2016, but it is not reflected whatsoever in our politics.
We should talk more about social media and the role of the internet, but you have some really nice observations in the book about how the popular culture either reflected or reinforced this sense of grievance or victimization or oppression. You write about VH1's role in the 1990s.
Oh, yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that, and then just keep going, because you also.
I'd like to talk about the concerts.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But also that every era gets the monsters it deserves, I think, is the line that you said. So
well,
talk
thank
a
you
little,
for
talk a little bit about
He
that.
actually read the whole book. Thank you for that. Or this is the most artful, strategically employed skim I've ever seen in my life.
This AI is just fantastic. I did read I used to be your editor. Of course I read the whole book, for Christ's sake. It's a great book. Sentence for sentence, Frank is just one of the great writers. I think you all know this, but it's
As we were
just a pleasure
saying,
to read.
yeah, the VH1 mentioned in the book. Do you all remember that moment in time? I think it was the 90s, late 80s, but I think it was more the 90s, when that kind of entertainment story template, the behind the music story, was always about like the incredible, horrible forces this person had to push through and what they had to overcome to get where they were. And that, like the popularity of that kind of narrative, where there was no such thing as achievement unless it was achievement in the face of obstacles and hardships and handicaps and personal demons. And I think that there's something really, really weird about that. It told you that unless you can claim victimization on your way to becoming a victor, you're really not as kind of big and admirable as someone else. And you could see people in the culture trying as they never did before in circumstances where there really wasn't that much to work with. I mean, there are people who are hideously oppressed. There are people, I mean, we have to make distinctions here. There are people who are the victims of terrible injustices, but I see all around me now, and I think we began to see it more then, people who are searching for the patch of ground on which they can claim victimization because there's some sort of weird valor in that, and you're not really impressive unless you've overcome your marginalization and your victimization, even if you have to exaggerate or invent it, which we see a lot of. We see people claiming offense or claiming oppression in circumstances where it's urgent that they do so, and in circumstances where it isn't. But since we're on music, I did want to say this one thing. I'm also fascinated. We're talking about why are we this way? Why are we so petty with each other? Why are we turned against each other? We have a service, this doesn't get written about much, we have a service economy now that is part and parcel of the digital age, where almost everything you do comes in more tiers than it ever did before. Whether it's your health club membership, whether it's the ride share that you're calling, like you have all of these options and you choose one, and often your choice is publicly visible, and it tells you exactly which rung of the ladder you inhabit, and it tells everybody around you whether they are on a lower rung or a higher rung. So we have these tools to measure ourselves against the people around us as never before. And I was thinking about this when my nieces and nephews were all like flying to this city or that to go to the Taylor Swift concert and getting their tickets. When I was their age and I would go to concerts, or when I was a teenager, I remember the way you got a good seat. The arena maybe had 4 sections or 3 sections with 4 or 3 prices. Many of you will remember this. And the way you got a really good seat was like the way I ended up in the 8th row at a Queen concert was by sleeping out overnight at the Hartford Civic Center box office. I don't know that that's the best way to spend a youth, but there was something egalitarian about it, right? And as I said, and then you got in there, and by the way, just so you know, you're listening to a real schmuck. My prize for sitting in the 8th row is at the end of the concert when Freddie Mercury threw out his tambourine, which I guess he did. In my hash-induced haze, I stood up with my arms like this, and as if it was a game of horseshoes, it came right down over my arm. and I went home with Freddie Mercury's tambourine, and I put it on a prized place on my bookcase. And then about 8 years later, realized I had no idea what happened to it, and to this day I have no idea. Like I lost Freddie Mercury's tambourine,
Oh my God.
But anyway, but back to the reason I'm talking about. But the reason I'm talking about concerts, if you went to a Taylor Swift concert, there were probably 1,000 different ticket prices, right? And they ranged from a lot to stratospheric, and everybody in there knew if you saw somebody sitting in the first 10 rows. Like if you saw a family of 4, a lot of families went together. You saw a family of 4 in the first 10 rows. You're looking at the expenditure, again, especially when you put in travel and that, of like maybe $20,000 to go to this concert, right? It's an exhibition of wealth, but it's also this kind of tiering in that concert that's a metaphor, I think, for what we do across the service economy. I mean, the airplane being the best example.
And then you get your face rubbed in it because you see on the Instagram feed of your friends that they are having the benefit of the $20,000 concert, and you're sitting at home.
And on
or
Instagram,
searching for,
and social media is like such an engine of envy. I mean, on Instagram, it's not necessarily a Taylor Swift concert. Like to go on Instagram is to think that everybody but you is at a wedding in the tropics with a raised glass of champagne and a beautiful sunset behind them. In truth, there are more people crying into their popcorn in bed, but they don't put that on Instagram, and so we have this completely false, lacquered idea about people's lives.
Talk about the monsters.
Oh, I didn't get to the monsters yet. I think I was just making the point that if you look at some of the entertainment that has had the greatest traction with young people, it's so negative, it's so dystopian. I mean, the whole idea of one of the biggest genres of YA, young adult fiction, being dystopias, that says a lot about the moment. But I talk in particular about zombies and how the Victorians had vampires and Frankenstein, and in the nuclear age when people were freaked out about the atom bomb, we had Godzilla. And we have zombies. We have The Walking Dead. And we have so many iterations of The Walking Dead. There's a funny quote from some academic that I use in the book about the cable channel AMC basically just becoming a zombie delivery system, which is totally true. But I think that says something about us. And
we feel like we don't have free will, that we're trapped, that we're oppressed by it. Speaking of academics, you also have a psychiatrist in the book arguing that there's actually kind of a physiological reinforcement mechanism that helps explain the grievance culture.
Yeah, it's James Kimmel, and I forget the term he uses, but he talks about people being addicted to anger. Right?
Revenge addiction.
Revenge addiction.
Which is a great term.
And he says, I think quite perceptively, that the kind of paradigm of revenge addiction is our President Trump. And you're seeing that, he has made vows of and acts of revenge a part of his political identity from the very beginning. But I mean, boy, in the last, whatever else you think of him, in the last 2.5, 3 weeks, I mean, that has been maybe the most dominant theme in all of his actions as president so far. And it's just interesting that flies. It's interesting that people respond to that in a positive and even approving way.
Yeah. I mean, you covered George W. Bush and wrote a book about him as well. Talk a little bit about the contrast between those two men and their politics. I mean, in the sense of how one uses grievance politics and how the other kind of addressed Americans' sense of.
Well, I mean, look at their, and then I actually would like to hear you put Clinton into the equation because you covered the Clinton White House.
I did.
And very, very expertly. So I'll answer about George W. Bush and then you answer about Bill Clinton. But I mean, just look at some of the slogans. Like George Bush identified himself as, his principal slogan was a compassionate conservative. Nothing in the slogans of the right today or of Donald Trump would use the word compassionate. I mean, think about this. Ron DeSantis, elected twice by huge margins as the governor of Florida. Yes, he bombed as a presidential candidate, but nonetheless, he remains, by any normal measurement, a very successful American politician. His signature phrase is that Florida is where woke goes to die. Compare a compassionate conservative with where woke goes to die. Like, that's what's happened to the tenor of our discourse, and not solely in the Republican Party. I mean, you see those kind of blame game mechanisms and that demonization of forces on the left as well, very much so. But tell me about Clinton.
Yeah, I mean, Clinton was a personally kind of, and again, like it's not like there isn't a basis, legitimate basis we all have at some degree, to some degree, for a sense of grievance. But he was pretty consumed by grievance, and no less a counselor than Nelson Mandela at one point pulled him aside and said, you got to get over this. You can't, it's consuming you and it's bad for your country.
Grievance about Hillary's vast right-wing conspiracy?
Yeah,
or?
the sense that his political
No, that's
enemies
the phrase
were and like Donald Trump, you know, that he was being prosecuted unfairly, that, you know, part of Donald Trump's thing is history began with him. Nothing like this has ever happened before. He's history's greatest victim and history's greatest hero.
I think you can just say greatest and it covers everything. Yeah.
But you know, Bill Clinton certainly felt like he was being hounded, that the law was being used against him. Lawfare, as we say now, was being used against him, and that the vast right-wing conspiracy was closing in utterly unjustly. And as I say, it was Nelson Mandela, you know, again, who certainly had a claim to feel like a victim.
Yes. This is
and
what I mean.
helped the whole country
This
transcend
is what I mean
that.
about making, we need to make distinctions.
Yeah.
Trump, Mandela, yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, and I'm going to open it up to you guys for questions in a second. I don't mean to hog all the questions of Frank, but you should talk a little bit about, so how do you get over this? Like, how does one, as an individual, and how do we as a society overcome this grievance Olympics?
I mean, as an individual, it's maybe a little bit easier to answer that question, but, and it's the thing that ties this book to my previous one, which is you can choose to focus on the ways in which you've been shortchanged and on what you lack. Or you can choose to focus on the opportunities you've been given and what you have. I mean, I think that's the kind of fundamental trick of life and the fundamental trick of happiness. I've never been happier than since I had my stroke and had that period where I had to recognize that as difficult as those months were and as scary as it is to be at risk of it happening to my other eye and losing my sight, like I had to kind of do the work of realizing how much would never change in my life, like a wonderful family, how many wonderful bequests have come my way, and I had never spent that sort of time making that psychological shift, which is bad on me, and most people do it sooner, I think. But we're kind of, one of us after another in a way that kind of accretes, we're choosing, often in our personal lives, but certainly in our politics, to focus on what isn't going exactly as we want it and what isn't conforming to our dreams and our expectations. And you can't do that in a democracy. It's the nature of a democracy that you have to be willing to live. You can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I do not expect any politician to mirror exactly what my views are or to make me happy all the time. And I often will vote or exalt people in a manner that's about their ability to do reasonably right by lots of us versus their ability to give me exactly what I want. So we need to do that as individuals in a democracy. And in a societal sense, there are all of these things we need to do at the same time in concert with one another to get us to a less extreme place. We need certain matters of political reform so that we don't end up with primaries that are only kind of, that the only voters in the primary extremists, we don't end up come a general election choosing between a far right and a far left candidate and not having anyone of moderation to vote for. We need to stop talking, as we have been for decades, about a national service program, and we need to actually come up with one and popularize it, because there are fewer and fewer arenas of American life in which people from diverse backgrounds mingle. We are siloed in our neighborhoods. We're siloed on the internet, and I think I think that goes nowhere because everybody assumes it would only work if it's compulsory. And I think you could design such a national service program with incentives built in, so that you actually got enormous participation. And I think it's one of those things that, as it began to get robust participation, it would become voguish. It would become a default impulse, and it would get bigger and bigger. Those are just a few things.
You know, I didn't, among your credentials, I failed to list at the beginning, is that you're now also a professor of journalism. And I'm curious, what do you, and I swear I'm going to open it up after this, but I'd like to, do you see this in your students? Or what's your experience of them and their kind of sense of oppression, sense of victim, or sense of possibility on the other side, and sense of excitement about their own futures. And how do you teach them?
I don't know if I'll ever figure out how to teach them. And that's not about them, that's about my failings. But they actually give me a lot of hope. Now, my sample set is not representative when I'm teaching at Duke, which I think we're down to a 6% acceptance rate. So for starters, a lot of the young men and women there assume correctly that they are in a good place pointed toward the future. Also, Duke does not draw as many of what we call the social justice warriors as some of its peer schools admission percentage-wise do. Because if you can get into a school with a 6% acceptance rate and you choose Duke over Yale or Brown or whatever, you're being lured by the romance of a Southern university. You like the idea of a big sports tradition. You're not likely to be the social justice warrior. That said, my students, the student body skews progressive because of the generation, because of the age. And I've been really encouraged because I go out of my way, just because I think it's so important, to give to them guest speakers who are from the conservative side, to sometimes argue a conservative viewpoint so that they can see that there's another way to look at things that is not just what they perceive as MAGA hatred. And I have never had a student complain. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the writing of Kevin Williamson, a very brilliant conservative writer, who gets in a lot of trouble. And for instance, one bit of trouble he got into, I think it was a couple of tweets years ago, where as an intellectual matter, like playing with the idea to its conclusion, he said, if you truly believe that abortion is the taking of a life, which he does, then we have to have a discussion about criminal sanctions, right? That got him fired from The Atlantic weeks after he was hired because they hadn't noticed that. And he was exiled in other places. He's a brilliant, brilliant writer. And I thought, you know what? I'm gonna have him zoom into class and talk to my students about opinion writing. And I did what I always do, and I said, you're expected to educate yourself about the speaker, come with intelligent questions. And I said, and you're going to find some stuff about Kevin Williamson that's going to make you really uncomfortable. And you know what you do with that? Challenge him on it. Talk to him about it. He'll take your questions. I thought, okay, if I'm going to get canceled, this is when it's going to happen. If I'm going to, no, it didn't. And that has been my experience in class after class. We're doing a disservice and we're selling them short when we say that students of this generation can't entertain other ideas. The sad truth of the matter is they're often not asked to entertain other ideas. It is often the fault of the schools themselves, secondary as well as higher education, and the fault of their instructors, who themselves are so mired in a certain viewpoint that they don't take the time to insist on some ideological elasticity and experimentation among their students.
You have please go ahead. That deserves it. You have a lovely term in the book for how you think of your own role, standing up in front of these students, that you're an emissary of doubt, which I thought was...
Yeah, because I don't really know anything at all. I mean, because I think it's important for us all. I mean, I have some strong convictions, and they may be different 5 months from now, and I know for a solid fact I'm not one of the smartest people in the room, or even one of the 100 smartest people in the room. And I kind of want my students to feel the same way about themselves. I want them to be confident enough to play with ideas, but I want them to understand that other people's ideas are just as valid. Not all of them, but most of them. I mean, there's some ideas we can't sanction. And I think you just kind of have to recognize that you don't have the answer to or the correct view on everything.
All right, over to you guys. And I don't think we have a mic, so I'm going to have to, please go ahead, sir.
When Trump was shot, I noticed that there was a change of an attitude of grievance to an attitude of unity. Do you find that people change for short periods of time because of causation?
First of all, I think that period, did everyone
Maybe
hear the
repeat
question?
that,
yeah. The gentleman said he noticed that when Trump was shot, there was a period of unity right afterwards, a brief one. And what? From a period of grievance. And how does that happen, or why does that happen, essentially? I'm paraphrasing. I didn't notice much of a period of unity, to be honest. I mean, what I noticed, I don't think that's an example of people letting go of grievance. I think that's an example of politesse, of etiquette. I think there were 48 or so hours after Trump was shot when his normal critics felt this is not the moment to dwell on the fact that, in fact, he's the victim now of a kind of political violence that he has in previous moments actually incited or encouraged. I think it was like something terrible has happened. None of us as polite human beings wish physical harm on a presidential candidate, a president to be a past president. And so for 48 hours, let's at least not use the kind of language we did. But I didn't see anything that to me looked like a real unity. That's just my take.
But he spoke to it. He spoke to unity after that.
Trump?
Yes.
Well, actually, Trump will always periodically make little nods at unity, but what I also heard from him and from everyone around him is this is the fault of the left. You have so demonized Donald Trump. You have made him so hated that you basically you pulled the trigger. I don't think that's unity.
There's a question all the way in the back.
Yeah, you said students need to consider different views. Well, first of all, I mean, considering different views is free speech. I mean, free speech is what you allow in the promotion of different views and and to try to kind of encourage the consideration of different views. And I think demonstrations are a rich and necessary and an important part of university life. Where we got into trouble or where things became very difficult, and what I think you're referring to is when some of those demonstrations include language that seems to some people, that is hate speech to some people and that feels like a physical threat to them, then what do you do? And one of the things that distresses me, and I would really love to hear you on this, is we talk about this like free speech or no free speech as if these judgment calls are clear, as if it's really simple to say, here's the definition of where you can start restricting things. And this is really tough, evolving, situation by situation stuff. I think we do need on campuses to make sure there are not demonstrations that are endangering the physical well-being of other people. Shy of that, I want us to be permissive, but that kind of criteria I just gave you, you could find circumstances where that no longer tells you enough of an answer, and you've got to kind of like just muddle your way through it. What do you think?
It was just, to me, that period of protest was an interesting example of how quickly people can abandon past positions and switch polarities when it's convenient for them, because what we saw was, you know, we've been hearing from the left for a number of years that speech can be a form of violence, yeah. Speech can make you unsafe. And the right, and I think this has been a kind of a disaster in some ways for the Democratic Party, has been able to take kind of ownership of the idea of free speech. But as soon as those campus protests started happening, one of the things you heard from the right was, this speech is violent, it's making people unsafe, it shouldn't be happening, it needs to be cracked down on. And there's a kind of absence of principle and, you know, and I think to some degree we're all guilty of this, an opportunistic kind of effort to use everything as a to seek political advantage. And I don't think that is healthy. And in general, we do talk a lot, I mean, this is my own trite kind of observation, is we talk a lot about free speech. I don't think speech is the problem. I think listening is the problem.
Yeah, that's well said.
And with free speech, there should come an obligation to listen. And that's something that I think we should be trying to reinforce in the culture. Please, back here.
I had a question. Today I saw that Trump is talking about melding religion and the government. What do you make of the grievance that is painted in religious terms today with the argument that Christians are being oppressed?
I mean, this to me is a good example.
Repeat them.
What do I make of the argument today that Christians are being oppressed? This is what I mean about people kind of looking for insult and wanting to claim, like, it's like we live in an era of oppression envy. Is it the case? Is it the case that in some school districts, in some corners of American life, there has been such promotion of kind of minority groups, including minority religions, and that has tipped into putting on the defensive people who may be in the majority group or who are in the religion that is more common, Christianity. Yeah, that happens. You see overzealous overkill all over the place. But if Christians are being oppressed, I sure didn't notice that when Pam Bondi sat in her confirmation hearings with a big-ass crucifix, like right there. I didn't notice it when Carolyn Levitt, every time she goes to the podium, is wearing a big cross around her neck. And I'm not one of those people who like goes looking for, we often misunderstand separation of church and state, and I actually really respect religious people, and people of faith have done many of the most important things in history in our society, along with the Crusades and stuff like that, yes. I'm not editing that out. But I have great respect for it. But it does bother me, and it certainly doesn't seem like Christian oppression, to look at Pam Bondi in that confirmation hearing, to have her wearing her religion as if it's a credential. And that's the problem. If you kind of look at Trump's language, if you look at the language of the Project 2025 people, whatever, like religion, they talk about religion as a kind of credential and almost litmus test. That is not this country, and that I find very frightening.
Yes, sir, back here. Yeah, please.
Yes, I was wondering if you could reflect upon the impact, if any, of social media on the sort of growth and development of grievance.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we talked a little bit about that before, but there are two main ways in which social media has been a grievance multiplier. And I don't know like how we turn back the clock on either. One is when we're talking about social media, we're talking about a kind of facet or expression of the internet. And we're talking about the fact that in a way that was not true 30, 40 years ago to anything near this extent, you now have the ability to go and find, you have the ability to curate information, to filter information, to choose information from this infinite menu that you never had before. Because the internet itself is infinite. You can feel like you are being active and taking agency. You can feel like you're well informed because you can click and click and click and find all these things. But most of that information is not vetted. Much of it is wrong. And you can create a narrower and narrower band in which you live and think because of what the internet and social media have done in terms of all of these choices. And then the second thing that goes along with that, and there's a lot has been written about this, I'm just repeating what other people have written whole books about, social media prioritizes and rewards anger. Like if you want something to go viral, the safest bet is to just be splenetic and to write something that is a howl of rage at an identified enemy. And when that is happening, and it's happening among people who are living in really narrow ideological, political bands that don't allow any sort of doubt or any crosstalk in, boy, that's grievance.
All the way back there, please.
Sherry Mueller, professor at American University in Washington. Would you elaborate and embroider a bit on your national service program, how you think it would break us out of our silos, and are there other things in addition to that?
Yeah, I don't think it would in and of itself break us out of our silos. And there's a ton of other things I would recommend. And in fact, the last stretch of the book is basically about you kind of need to do all these things in concert if we're to have hope, if we're to have a chance. But in terms of national service, yeah, I mean, I'm just repeating what other people, various politicians have put that in the foreground of their policy proposals. Pete Buttigieg talked a lot about it when he campaigned for president in 2020, but he was hardly the first or the last. We could do things where like maintenance of parks was done in part by people in a national service program, where urban renewal projects were done in part by people in a national service program. And we could nudge people into it, not by requiring it, because I don't think we'd ever have Congress or anyone do that, but by, there could be job opportunities on the far side that are connected to it. There could be GI Bill type incentives about doing it. And you would put it together in such a way where, like, let's say you are part of a team doing park maintenance. You are chosen in an almost kind of random way, like maybe all of you have indicated a preference for that you are not doing what so many students now do and following your high school classmates to college so that you can replicate that experience. You are now You are now kind of bumping up against people who were rural if you were urban, or vice versa, who are of different races, who are of different socioeconomic backgrounds. Our greatest segregation is not by race, it's by socioeconomic status. And I think you would design it with that very much in mind. And I just think it would be helpful because it's really, really hard to dismiss and demonize people if you've seen them in 3-dimension. And you've probably had this experience as often as I had. It's a kind of little experience a lot of us have as journalists that I think is very telling in a wider sense, which is someone will send me, a reader will send me just a nasty, nasty, like such a nasty note. And I'll reply, not always, but sometimes, and I'll say, I'm really sorry you took it that way. That's not what I intended. Here's why I believe that. Almost invariably, you get a message back, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to, like as soon as you become a human being and not an abstraction, they actually don't want to fight with you as much. And they actually kind of think, well, maybe this person isn't all bad. We need to replicate that experience as often and as much we can with policies and in other ways.
Please.
Do you think there's any distinction between perceived grievance and legitimate
Yeah,
grievance?
yeah.
How would you draw that?
Well, what do you, I mean, I think the distinction is kind of just what you said. Some is just perceived, some is legitimate.
Do you think people can see that difference?
If is there a difference between perceived difference and legitimate, perceived grievance and legitimate grievance? I mean, yeah, one's perceived and one's legitimate. Can people see the difference? No, I'm not being, can people see the difference? Some people can, some people can't. But part of the problem, this is a kind of half answer to your question, part of the problem is we live in a culture and a climate of grievance entrepreneurs, of pundits, to be honest, who have one lens for the world, because that is the lens that has led to their paid speeches, that has led to their bookings on whatever the MSNBC or CNN panel is. And so it's almost like a shingle or a brand that they stray away from at their economic and public stature peril. And they end up looking at events and finding the conclusion that they're determined to draw. And the example I give in the book, because I think it's such a clear one, is I was shocked. But when Brittany Griner was imprisoned in Russia, which was horrible, I actually saw a number of columns, commentary on the left, saying that Brittany Griner was being left to languish in a Russian prison because she's a woman, because she's black, and because she's a lesbian. And if those things weren't true, we'd be paying more attention to her. I was more familiar with her as a political prisoner and with every aspect of that than any other political prisoner in the last couple of decades, because celebrity was driving plenty of discussion. But the people writing that were people whose kind of model is I see racism everywhere. I see homophobia everywhere. I see sexism everywhere, and so something big is happening in the news. I'm going to fit that into this. It feeds those kind of illegitimately perceived grievances when thought leaders do that, and they do it often.
And in fact, she got out sooner than another American.
Paul Whelan. We only learned about Paul Whelan in the 10th paragraph of stories about her. He'd been in longer, and he got out later. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So one of your New York Times colleagues, Peter Baker, did a daily podcast about Jimmy Carter, and said that it's unlikely, quote, good people like him will be president in the future. Forget about what he was like as a president, but as a person. And I'm just, apart from the presidency, we're looking at the cabinet positions now. Do you think competency and character are going to be important qualities for leadership?
Will competence and character be important? I don't know. That's up to us, right? I mean, are we as voters and as people who talk to and try to encourage those around us to do what we believe is the right thing, are we going to elevate that stuff? Are we going to be as impressed by and are we going to celebrate that the way we do other things? I don't know. Right now, competence and character seem to be really low on the list of qualifications, in my view, which, granted, has some political bias in it. I refuse to believe that they've gone out of fashion forever, but I think it's up to us.
And I think that's probably where we need to end it, because they're going to give us the hook at 45 minutes. So
Thank you all.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.